Hi, the purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to the book Universal Currency, The Path to Fair Trade and Real Money. Now you're watching Part 1, which is an introduction to Part 2. Thank you for tuning in. The target audience for this presentation is everyone who uses currency, including ordinary people, policymakers, and economists. In Part 1, we will discuss what is money, how is it different from currency, we'll present an example of how ancient currency was made, and two types of modern currency creation, and lastly, an example of cryptocurrency creation. We'll highlight the main flaws in these approaches to currency creation. We'll also discuss if we actually need currency and what could be an alternative to it. In part 2 of this presentation, we will discuss our proposed model for universal currency. You can watch part 2 in a separate video on this channel. I recommend watching both parts as they relate things together. Let's start with the definition of money. Money has been defined as a system of value that serves as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. As a medium of exchange, it helps us transfer the value, the worth of goods and services from one individual or entity to another. As a unit of account, it helps us measure that value. And as a store of value, it helps us store that value for later use. The purpose of all of this is to facilitate trade, as money was invented as a solution to make trade more efficient and replace bartering. Note that what has been valuable in the past, or what may or may not have a value in the future, is not a good representation of money, because money represents something valuable in the present. It is interesting to note that the word money has nothing to do with the definition of money. It is derived from the Latin moneta, which was a title given to the Roman goddess Juno. Moneta comes from the Latin word moneo, which means to warn. The legend says that the sacred geese of Juno saved the Romans from invasion by the Gauls by making too much noise that warned the Romans. And because the temple of Juno was the location of the Roman mint, the name moneta came to mean a place for coining money. So money really means warning. It is a remarkable coincidence that money comes with a warning label, because you should be careful whether the money you are using represents true value or not in our current monetary system. What about currency? Is it different from money? Well, currency is considered a tangible form of money, and it is derived from the word carencia, which means running or flowing. It is something in general circulation or current use. So money and currency are not the same. Money equals value, real value in the present, whereas currency is what is circulating as value, which could be real money, in addition to fake money that does not represent real value in the present. So currency is the big total, which includes the real money and fake money. And currency has inherent problems because of who, when, how much of it, and on what basis it is created. I will quickly go over previous and current currency creation methods, and will evaluate each system based on its merits. What do I mean by merits? I mean, 1, is that system fair and just? 2, is it logical? And 3, does currency represent money correctly, that is only real money, not fake money? Which means, does that currency have real value in the present time? First, we will see how kings created currency, then how more modern governments created currency, and then we will look more carefully into fiat currency creation, which I represent here with the purple coin, BG, B representing private banks and G representing government, since they really act as partners in this fiat currency production. And 4, we'll take a look at cryptocurrencies. And finally, we will be talking about our universal currency, V. V, or value, will be the main topic of the second part of this presentation. We will show how the universal currency, V, the currency of value, shines above all other forms of currency. As an example of how kings created currency, we will look into the Roman Empire's model. Here, gold and silver deposits were claimed by the state as imperial property. So in this form of currency creation, Caesar decides that he owns the gold of the world, and only he is allowed to mine it, melt it into coins, put his face on it, and take your goods and services in exchange. You can see here the aureus, which is the gold coin with the face of Emperor Hadrian on it. Romans also used other metals. For example, the denarius is supposed to be a silver coin, but was subject to debasing, so instead of using pure silver, they often added cheaper metals to it. Debasing is an example when a circulating currency is not representing money, which is the true value. Romans often staffed their most productive mines with forced labor. This included slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals who were sentenced to work in the dangerous conditions of the mine. That's how the ancient Romans did it. But how about more modern governments? How did they create currency? First, they started with direct money printing. Then they became more sophisticated and switched to indirect money printing. First, we'll discuss how direct money printing works. Direct money printing means that you give someone a paper that is supposed to represent something of value, but it does not really have any value, yet you still use it to obtain goods and services from others which have real value. Our first example comes from the United States. During the Civil War, rival factions printed their own currencies, which led to inflation in the Union, and here you see the greenbacks, but also led to hyperinflation in the Confederacy, and here you see the graybacks. Our second example comes from Mexico. In the Revolutionary era, the Mexican rival factions excessively printed their own currencies, leading to widespread hyperinflation. And not long after that, they did it again in the oil and boom bust. Our third example comes from Germany. The Germans faced huge war operations after the First World War, and their solution to that was to print huge volumes of money. This led to one of the most infamous cases of hyperinflation in history, where the currency became worthless and prices rose astronomically. Our fourth example comes from Argentina, which is no stranger to direct money printing either. Our fifth example comes from Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, someone thought it was meaningful to print $100 trillion bills. We start wondering if this was a joke. Well, yes, the joke is on us, the people. And our final and most recent example of direct money printing comes from Lebanon. It is a striking example of when you simply print money, you can cause catastrophe with hyperinflation, devaluation of your currency, and wiping out people's lifetime savings. Bottom line here, you can't create value where there is none. When you create something fake, it does not end well. Direct money printing is a clear example where currency is different from money. Now we turn our attention into the partnership between banks and governments. That's how modern currency is created, in a process I refer to as indirect money printing, which is quite sophisticated. So what is indirect money printing? Let's take the United States as an example because it's easier to understand, but other countries have similar systems. Indirect money printing is a complex, multifaceted system of creating money out of thin air. It is harder for the common person to see and understand. But let's try to dissect it. To do so, we have to understand how private banks operate, how does the federal system or Federal Reserve System work, what is the role of the Treasury Department, and what is the multiplier effect. Let's start with the multiplier effect. The formula for the money multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve requirement. So for the 10% reserve requirement, the multiplier would be 1 divided by 0.1, or 10%. So an initial deposit can potentially create 10 times that amount in the money supply. In the next slide, we will show you a clear example of how that works. But it's important to note that in 2020, the reserve requirement was lowered to 0. We can divide 1 by 0, but we can divide it by a number close to 0. So let's say if you divide 1 by 10 to the power minus 12, so in this case, $1 can create $1 trillion. So here's an example of how the multiplier effect works with a 10% reserve requirement. If you deposit $1,000 into Bank X, then Bank X must keep $100 in reserves, but can lend out $900. The $100 is the 10% reserve requirement. The borrower of this $900 spends those $900, and one way or another, it gets deposited into Bank Y. Now, Bank Y has $900 and must keep $90 in reserve. That's the 10% reserve requirement, but can lend out $810. This process keeps repeating, with each loan creating a new deposit, leading to a much larger total money supply than the initial $1,000 deposit. So that's how the multiplier effect works. During the 2011 to 2020 period, US private banks created on average $10.7 trillion per year in that fashion. As you can see here, private banks are giving something they do not have, an enormous amount of it. What happens when this currency crosses borders? Let's think about this a little bit. Most countries accept the US dollar as a valid currency, although a large sum of it is created out of debt, and they do so in exchange for their goods and services. But does the US accept the currencies of other countries when they buy goods and services from the US? Consider this example. Someone wants to buy a house in California. He gets a loan from a US bank for $1 million. But that $1 million is actually debt money that was created out of thin air. It does not exist or represent existing real value. The bank just created it. The person who sold the house now instantaneously have $1 million, and he can purchase lots of goods and services from another country with that newly created currency. But the people of that country had no say whatsoever in determining the value of that house that was sold for $1 million. Maybe their estimated value for it is $500,000 or $200,000. What about the Treasury Department? What's their role? Well, the US Treasury is legally obligated to fund a budget approved by Congress. What does it do when there is a budget deficit? It will issue Treasury securities, which is a euphemism for debt. Who can buy this debt, those Treasury securities? Well, you have to be a primary dealer to do so. You have to sign up to become a primary dealer. Primary dealers are mostly major global banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and many others. Because they signed up to be primary dealers, they are obligated to participate in US Treasury auctions. Once they buy that debt, they will try to sell it in turn. But what if they cannot sell it to investors inside the US or to investors outside the US? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank can now buy those US Treasury securities from primary dealers in what is known as open market operations. But the Federal Reserve does not buy Treasury securities with pre-existing money. It creates new money by crediting bank accounts with reserves. So private banks and central banks are giving something they do not have. So that's how modern currency is created. What about the unit of account? What is it now? Does anyone know? Well, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act became law, and this law said that the gold is interconvertible with the US dollar at 20.67 US dollars for 1 ounce of pure gold. This was changed just before the end of the Second World War, and 1 ounce of gold was decided to be equivalent to 35 US dollars. Many nations started storing their gold in the US because it was a safe haven. What happened next came as a reality check. The deteriorating US balance of payments, combined with military spending and foreign aid, resulted in a large supply of dollars around the world. There were more foreign-held dollars than the United States had gold. There was a loss of confidence in the US government ability to meet its obligations. So in 1971, US President Richard Nixon suspended the ability to convert the dollar to gold. He basically said, sorry guys, you can't take your gold back, keep our dollars. So what is the unit of account for the US dollars today? Other national currencies were tied. They were pegged to the dollar. So what is the unit of account for any fiat currency now? Moving on to cryptocurrency. What is cryptocurrency? It's based on blockchain technology. So what's a blockchain? It's a decentralized, shared digital ledger of transactions that is secured by cryptography and distributed across many computers. So transactions, which can be one transaction or many transactions, are organized in a block, which is represented by the data face in this block. The hash is basically a digital fingerprint that is used to secure blocks, but this is a whole different topic that we are not going to discuss here. We will only focus on the big picture. So the data in the case of Bitcoin, for example, would say who is sending the Bitcoin, to whom, and what is the amount of Bitcoin sent. By software protocol, every 10 minutes a new block is confirmed. In the early days of Bitcoin, confirming a block generated 50 Bitcoins out of thin air per block as a reward for the first miner who confirmed that block. Even if the block has only zero point 0.1 Bitcoins worth of transactions, it would generate 50 Bitcoins. Note that the smallest possible unit, 1 Satoshi, equal 10 to the power minus 8 Bitcoins. So theoretically, confirming transactions as small as 10 to the power minus 8 Bitcoin could have generated 50 Bitcoins. Now, the reward for confirming the block is about 3 Bitcoins. This is because every 4 years the reward is halved. Note that it's thought that the unknown creator, developer of Bitcoin, mined around 1 million Bitcoin out of 21 million total. Also note that 95% of Bitcoins have already been mined. So how does this mining process work for Bitcoin? Miners use specialized hardware, such as application-specific integrated circuits, to solve a complex mathematical problem, a hash-based cryptographic puzzle. The successful miner receives the reward of newly created cryptocurrency and any transaction fees included in the block. So basically, you buy a special computer and you download a specific software and you join a mining pool to increase your chances of winning, and you let the hardware and software do the computations, and there you go, you get to create cryptocurrency. Well, this is a very fancy computer game, but this is not how you create a currency for the world to use. This does not reflect what kind of production is occurring in the economy globally. In fact, currency is not something that you can mine, whether physically, like gold, or digitally, like a cryptocurrency. That is not the proper way of creating currency, as we will explore shortly. We are done talking about the creation of previous and existing currencies, but let's try to see if we actually need to have any currency at all. Well, this depends whether you're trying to conduct direct trade or indirect trade. Consider this example. If you have 4 people who know each other, and they know that they want each other's product, then they can simply meet and make the exchange directly. In this example, Peter wants pears, Mary wants sheep, Tina wants apples, and John wants metal rods. So the process here is quite simple. These 4 people meet and they just exchange the products, and each one gets what they want. But what if people did not know each other and did not know who wants what among these 4 products? Well, in this case, you need to have a matching algorithm so you can trade apples and sheep, apples and pears, apples and metal rods, pear and sheep, pear and metal rods, and sheep and metal rods. To do that, you will use the combination formula CNR equal n factorial divided by r factorial multiplied by n minus r factorial. So n is the total number of items. In our example, there are 4 products. And r is the number of items to choose from. In our example, r is 2 because we're doing one-to-one exchange. So the answer in this example will be 6, which is the same thing as saying we need 6 people to trade 4 products. Well, let's scale this up. The number of combinations of 2 from 100,000 products is about 5 billion, which is the same thing as saying we need 5 billion people to trade 100,000 products in this fashion. Now, 100,000 products do not represent all the products available on Earth, but it's still a significant number of products. And given the fact that we have 8 billion people on Earth, 5 billion people doing such trade is a reasonable number. In order to create such a system, you'd have to create the direct trading software or direct trading app. You can call it DTAP. But this is beyond the scope of our presentation. This concludes part 1 of our presentation. Please consider watching part 2, which is the main topic that we want to discuss. Thank you for watching.